On se sent en famille en ce sens que la Russie est une famille aussi pour l'Afrique. C'est une famille parce que nous avons la même histoire. La Russie a consenti d'énormes sacrifices pour libérer le monde du nazisme pendant la Seconde Guerre mondiale.
What if we told you that Russia, the vast empire stretching across 2 continents, never participated in Africa's colonial scramble? Strange, right? After all, this is the same Russia that expanded relentlessly across Eurasia, waging wars and conquering new territories. But when it came to Africa, a land of untapped resources and strategic importance, Russia didn't even try to get a piece of the pie. While European powers like Britain, France, and Portugal fought tooth and nail for their slice of Africa, Russia watched from the sidelines. But why exactly? Was it a lack of ambition, or was there something deeper at play? Let's find out. If we take a step back and look at Russia's position on the map, it's clear that geography itself was a monumental hurdle for the empire when it came to expanding into Africa. Unlike European colonial powers, who enjoyed strategic proximity to the African continent, Russia found itself in an awkward position. Isolated in the east, separated by vast distances, harsh climates, and rival powers who controlled key maritime routes. Let's take a closer look at why these geographical and logistical challenges were more than just inconvenient. They were insurmountable barriers that shaped Russia's empire-building decisions. First, it's crucial to understand the difference in maritime access. While the European colonial powers benefited from easy access to Africa via well-established sea routes, Russia was far from the world's oceans. The key to Europe's expansion into Africa was simple: proximity. Nations like Britain, France, and Portugal could sail directly from their ports in the Mediterranean and Atlantic to Africa's coast. They had direct routes that could be navigated quickly, providing not only a military advantage, but also an economic one, as trade and resources flowed smoothly between the continents. In contrast, Russia's northern ports were often blocked by ice for much of the year. Ports such as Arkhangelsk, which served as Russia's gateway to the west, were freeze-bound during the long winters, limiting any reliable sea routes for trade or military expeditions. Even in the warmer months, navigating the northern seas was fraught with difficulties due to the treacherous conditions, which made any venture to Africa from this direction unfeasible. Russia did have access to the Baltic Sea, but here the problem was more diplomatic and political than geographical. The Baltic was not a free, open sea. It was crowded with rival European powers. The area was controlled by major maritime nations like Denmark, Sweden, and more notably, the United Kingdom and France. These nations controlled the shipping lanes through which Russia would have had to navigate to reach Africa. The British, for example, had a tight grip on the sea routes to the Mediterranean, the Indian Ocean, and beyond. To get to Africa from the Baltic, Russia would need to secure a safe passage through these waters, which would have been almost impossible without confrontation or a major shift in the balance of European power. Given Russia's tensions with these European rivals, particularly Britain and France, it was simply not feasible to use these routes for expeditions to Africa. Now, the obvious question is why Russia didn't try to establish new routes, perhaps by developing ports closer to Africa. But even this would have been complicated by geopolitical obstacles. The Ottoman Empire controlled the Dardanelles Strait, a vital passage that connected the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. To access Africa from the Black Sea or the Caspian Sea, Russia would have needed to navigate through the Dardanelles, a waterway under Ottoman control. The Ottomans were not willing to let their strategic straits be used freely by a growing Russian empire. They, too, had territorial ambitions in the Mediterranean and beyond, and allowing Russia to move freely through the Dardanelles could have set off a diplomatic firestorm. As a result, Russia's access to the Mediterranean and therefore Africa was further limited by this crucial geopolitical barrier. Meanwhile, even if Russia had somehow bypassed these bottlenecks, it would still have been forced to contend with the British-dominated Suez Canal. By the late 19th century, the Suez Canal had become the lifeblood of European maritime travel to Asia and Africa. In essence, it was the gateway to Africa for all European powers. But Britain, having secured control over the canal in 1882, ensured that no other nation could easily challenge their dominance in the region. For Russia to reach Africa by this route would have meant having to negotiate with or force its way past the British, a move that was not only diplomatically risky, but would have also required substantial naval strength. Russia's lack of a substantial navy compared to Britain made this task even more daunting. In short, the physical geography of the region, combined with political obstacles, created a fortress-like barrier between Russia and Africa. When we step back to examine the broader picture, it becomes clear that Russia's limited access to Africa wasn't just about ports or control over strategic sea routes. The country's geography dictated that it simply wasn't well positioned for the kind of colonial expansion that was happening in Europe. For Britain, France, and Portugal, Africa was within arm's reach. But for Russia, Africa was separated by such distance and difficulty that it would have taken an enormous amount of resources to establish and maintain a foothold on the continent. In the face of such obstacles, it's easy to see why Russia never fully pursued a colonial presence in Africa. The cost and effort would have been astronomical, with no guarantee of success. It was a hard, cold reality that Russia had to face. It simply didn't have the infrastructure or geographical advantages that European powers enjoyed. Instead, Russia's attention shifted toward territories that were far more accessible, closer to home, and more strategically valuable. Thus, from a geographical and logistical perspective, Russia's lack of colonial presence in Africa was not a failure of ambition. It was a result of the harsh realities imposed by its location. The geographical isolation and diplomatic challenges made African colonization an impossible task for the Russian Empire. Instead of fighting against these overwhelming barriers, Russia focused its energies on more attainable goals, like expanding into Central Asia and Siberia. Africa, in this sense, was never truly within reach for Russia, and its colonial ambitions turned eastward instead. This geographical disadvantage wasn't just an isolated incident, it was part of the very fabric of Russia's imperial strategy, which would have lasting consequences for the country's relationship with Africa and the rest of the world. But to fully understand why Russia refrained from pursuing a colonial presence in Africa, we must examine the sheer cost involved in such an undertaking. While European powers could capitalize on the proximity of Africa and the relatively low logistical costs associated with their imperial pursuits, Russia found itself at a stark disadvantage. Here's a reminder to please like and share the video, and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. While geographical barriers were significant, the distance between Russia and Africa presented a financial burden that would have been difficult, if not impossible, to overcome. The Russian Empire was located thousands of miles away from the African continent, creating an economic and logistical nightmare for any potential colonization effort. For comparison, European powers such as Britain and France, situated closer to Africa, could organize military expeditions and trade ventures with relative ease. The proximity allowed them to send ships, troops, and resources at lower costs and in less time. But for Russia, the distances involved would have turned even the most modest colonial endeavor into an expensive multi-year project that would drain its treasury. Imagine the monumental task of establishing a military foothold in Africa. Russia would have had to navigate around obstacles such as the frozen northern ports, pass through the crowded Baltic, and then face the difficulties of reaching Africa via treacherous maritime routes. The journey alone would have been prohibitively expensive, requiring an immense commitment of resources for supply ships, troops, and support personnel. This was a cost that no empire could afford without the promise of significant returns. But even if Russia managed to secure a foothold, the long-term costs would only escalate. Maintaining a colonial presence on a continent so far from the Russian heartland would require ongoing supplies, military garrisons, and a vast infrastructure to connect the colony to the empire. The Russian treasury, already stretched thin by wars and internal conflicts, would not have supported such a venture. Another factor that made the colonization of Africa unfeasible for Russia was the fierce competition with established European powers. By the time Russia would have considered expanding into Africa, the major colonial players, Britain, France, Germany, and Portugal, had already staked their claims. These nations had long-standing maritime traditions and well-established networks of trade and military influence. making them far more equipped for colonial ventures. For Russia to successfully challenge these established powers in Africa would have meant direct military confrontations, something that Russian leadership would have been reluctant to pursue. Engaging in a battle for territories with countries that had far more advanced naval fleets, established trade routes, and colonial military forces would have been a highly risky and costly gamble. The military expenditure alone would have likely outweighed any potential benefits Russia might have gained from controlling African territories. The Russian Empire was already embroiled in conflicts closer to home, including wars with the Ottoman Empire, Persia, and most notably, the rise of Japanese imperialism in the East. Fighting a colonial war in Africa would have spread the empire's resources thin, potentially weakening its position on other fronts. Additionally, the colonies that European powers had already established were rich with resources that supported their imperial economies. By the time Russia considered African colonization, European countries had secured control of key trade routes, resource-rich regions like West Africa and the Congo Basin, and valuable territories like Egypt and South Africa. The Russian Empire would not have had the means or access to compete for these areas in any meaningful way, making the idea of entering into Africa's colonial race increasingly impractical. At best, Russia could only hope to occupy less strategically valuable regions, but even that would have come at a heavy cost and with little reward. The Russian Empire had a well-established imperial focus that was grounded not in the pursuit of African colonies, but rather in its territorial expansion to the east and south. During the 18th and 19th centuries, Russia concentrated its efforts on expanding into Central Asia, Siberia, and the Caucasus. These territories provided immediate, tangible benefits, such as access to natural resources, fertile land for agriculture, and strategic military positions. Central Asia, in particular, became a focal point for Russia's expansionist policies. The region was rich in resources such as cotton, gold, and oil, and its proximity to the Russian heartland made it a far more accessible target than distant African territories. As Russia expanded eastward, it encountered fewer logistical barriers compared to Africa, which was separated by seas and distant lands. The territories Russia pursued were also far easier to control, as they were in closer proximity to Russia's core military and administrative infrastructure. Moreover, the costs of colonizing these regions were lower, with fewer logistical hurdles and more accessible trade routes. At the time, the Russian Empire was also focused on securing its borders from rival powers such as the Ottoman Empire, the British Empire, and Persia. The need to defend its territories and secure its borders took precedence over any ambitions to establish a colonial presence in Africa. Russia's strategic priorities were more concerned with consolidating its control over Central Asia and ensuring its security against European encroachment than with engaging in the costly and uncertain venture of colonizing Africa. The governance of distant colonies requires not only military might, but also an administrative framework capable of supporting and sustaining the colony's economy. For Russia, managing territories as far away as Africa would have posed severe challenges. Establishing efficient governance, developing local industries, and building the necessary infrastructure for transportation and communication would have required enormous investments of time and money. The harsh African climate, with its diseases, unfamiliar terrain, and diverse peoples, would have further complicated efforts to establish long-term control. Unlike European colonial powers, which had decades of experience managing overseas territories, Russia had no prior history or expertise in administering colonies on a global scale. Furthermore, the resources Russia would have had to pour into such a venture would have left its existing territories vulnerable to internal unrest and external threats. The Russian Empire already faced significant challenges with its people, ranging from peasant uprisings to the administrative burdens of managing a vast and multi-ethnic empire. The Russian monarchy could hardly afford the luxury of investing in a far-flung colony when its territorial integrity and economic well-being were at stake. Ultimately, the costs of colonizing Africa were prohibitive for the Russian Empire, both in terms of financial investment and military resources. With no immediate returns and far too many barriers, Russia chose to focus its imperial ambitions closer to home, expanding into regions that were more accessible, strategically valuable, and easier to govern. Russia's decisions, influenced by these costs, marked a clear divergence from the path taken by European powers, allowing Russia to avoid the colonial trap in Africa, a choice that would later influence its role on the continent in the 20th century. Russia's historical absence from the colonial scramble in Africa, once seen as a disadvantage, has today been transformed into a unique diplomatic asset. Unlike European powers that still grapple with their colonial pasts, Russia has been able to position itself as a partner to African nations, devoid of the exploitative legacy that stains the colonial powers. This shift from failed colonization to modern diplomacy offers a fascinating look into how Russia has managed to maintain influence in Africa without engaging in traditional colonial practices. During the 20th century, Russia, and later the Soviet Union, took a decidedly different approach to Africa than its European counterparts. While colonial powers like Britain, France, and Belgium were still engaged in extracting resources and exploiting African populations, Russia was positioning itself as a champion for African sovereignty. This was particularly evident during the Cold War, when the Soviet Union found a natural ally in Africa's liberation movements. In the mid-20th century, as African nations began to fight for independence from European colonial powers, Russia recognized an opportunity to support these movements politically, militarily, and economically. The Soviet Union provided military aid and training to several African liberation groups, such as the African National Congress ANC in South Africa, the Algerian National Liberation Front FLN, and various groups in Angola, Mozambique, and Guinea-Bissau. Russia's support was not driven by the same imperial motivations that had fueled Western colonial expansion. Instead, the USSR viewed the African independence movements as part of a broader ideological struggle against Western imperialism, which it saw as a form of capitalist exploitation. Moscow's backing of these movements was also a strategic effort to expand its ideological influence across the globe. By aligning itself with African nations seeking freedom from colonial rule, Russia positioned itself as the defender of oppressed peoples and the antithesis of colonial exploitation. The Soviet Union's commitment to supporting African liberation had a profound impact on the continent, providing military aid, diplomatic support, and financial resources to movements that were often underfunded and undermanned. Russia's support for African independence was not simply ideological, it was also a strategic play in the larger Cold War rivalry with the United States. Moscow's influence in Africa was seen as a way to counter Western power, particularly as the US and European nations maintained their grip on much of Africa's economic and political structures. By offering aid to anti-colonial and later anti-imperial movements, Russia cemented itself as a key player in the geopolitical landscape of post-colonial Africa. The Soviet Union's legacy of support for African independence movements left an indelible mark on the continent. In the 1960s and 1970s, as newly independent African nations sought to define their political and economic futures, many turned to Moscow for guidance and assistance. The USSR's socialist model was attractive to many African leaders who saw it as an alternative to Western capitalist dominance. As a result, Russia found itself deeply involved in the political and military affairs of several African countries, offering expertise in state building, industrialization, and governance. One notable example of the Soviet Union's involvement was in Ethiopia, where the USSR became a crucial supporter of the Derg regime after its rise to power in 1974. The Soviet Union provided military aid, political support, and even direct military intervention in the Horn of Africa. Russia's commitment to Ethiopia was emblematic of its broader approach to Africa. As a partner in the fight against imperialism and a proponent of political and economic self-determination for African nations. While the Cold War period was marked by intense competition for influence in Africa between the Soviet Union and the United States, Russia's position as a champion of anti-colonial movements allowed it to build lasting relationships with several African countries. These relationships, based on mutual respect for sovereignty and independence, set the stage for Russia's modern diplomatic stance in Africa. After the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, Russia's role in Africa diminished as the country grappled with its own economic challenges and internal political turmoil. During the 1990s, Russia was largely focused on rebuilding its economy and consolidating its position within the global community. However, as the 21st century progressed, Russia began to reassert itself on the world stage, including in Africa. the end of the Cold War and the subsequent shift in global power dynamics offered Russia an opportunity to re-engage with Africa, especially as many African countries were seeking new partners outside of their traditional colonial relationships with Europe and the United States. In recent years, Russia has sought to re-establish itself as a key player in Africa by building on its historical legacy of support for African sovereignty and independence. Russia's current engagement with Africa is less about ideological alignment and more about strategic cooperation. Moscow has increasingly focused on strengthening economic and military ties with African countries, particularly in areas such as energy, mining, and defense. Russia's modern approach to Africa has been characterized by a focus on pragmatic partnerships rather than colonial-style exploitation. For example, Russia has actively pursued trade agreements and military contracts with African nations, offering its expertise in energy resources, infrastructure development, and defense systems. Moscow has also become a significant player in Africa's growing oil and gas sectors, with Russian companies involved in exploration and production across the continent. This approach, while still underpinned by a desire to build influence, avoids the heavy-handed colonial tactics of the past, instead focusing on mutually beneficial agreements and partnerships. Russia truly wants to be a partner and never wishes to be a master like the West. Do you think that this is the reason why now African nations are aligning with Russia and not the West? Let us know in the comment section. Is Russia better than the West for Africa? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.